So, please give it up for Mateo Murphy. Yes. How you doing?
Good, good.
Cool.
Happy to be here.
How did you first discover electronic music? How did you first start making it?
Well, I first discovered it. It was basically hearing pop on a radio, like records like Pump Up the Volume became really popular, and that was sort of my introduction to. It kind of followed that trail deeper and deeper underground. You know, discovered Detroit techno, Chicago house, and then the rave scene, and then it was all over at that point.
And did you start DJing first, or did you start making records?
This is so funny, but I used to DJ high school dances.
Yeah.
So
You gotta start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. Well, it was good because I had gear. So when in '93, when the rave scene started really developing in Montreal, and I wanted to participate, I already had turntables, I already had equipment, and I already had some music and some skill so it was kind of easy for me to get into that because it's pretty expensive at the time, you know. A pair of turntables and a mixer is not something everybody could afford. So I was kind of fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, and did you start making music? You thought, hey, I want to play out my own records?
The funny thing is I had played music before. When I was in high school, I had music classes and I played in the band and I played band's guitar, but I kind of lost interest in all of that when I started DJing. And it was really after a couple of years that I felt kind of limited in what I could do as a DJ, especially in terms of exposure. And everybody said, you know, you have to produce, you have to put out records. So that's sort of how I got back into it, buying gear and rating tracks. And as people said, you know, as the records came out, then the DJ offers came in as well. So it's very much the two really go hand in hand together.
Yeah, sure. And what were those first tracks like? Was there anyone you were trying to sound like?
No, it was really kind of, you hear records and you want to do stuff that sounds like that. And you kind of pick the records that seem the easiest to make in a way, you know? And it was at the time, it was really kind of the whole disco sampling craze. So I just sampled some disco records and borrowed a 909, and that was my first record.
Sidechain it, done.
I didn't know about sidechaining back then, or even compression. I don't even think my first record used a compressor. It was you know, everybody was kind of self-taught, and there was no internet really to learn these things. So you just did the best you could.
On that note, last year you decided to make a track every single week for a year, right? Yeah. Was the reason behind that anything to do with workflow, or was it just you had so many ideas you needed to get them out?
No, it was really workflow. It was mostly an exercise in discipline, because before that point, I mean, I did a lot of music in the early 2000s, but maybe in the middle, not so much, and there was a lot of reasons for that. But I just wasn't inspired, and it was also too many expectations, you know. From having put out records that were relatively successful and then wanting to put out an even, you know, more popular record. And that was sort of the problem with making music to sort of advance my DJ career, is that it was very oriented about, I need to make a hit record, you know, like this. And that puts a lot of pressure on you as a producer, because chances are you're not going to make a hit record. And you're going to spend 5 days in the studio, and if your goal is to make a hit record and you don't get there, then you're just going to get discouraged and you're not going to want to do anything. And that's basically what happened to me. So I did that as an exercise, really, to kind of discipline myself and to kind of focus more on the process of making music and not so much on the result that could come from it. And it ended up being a really good thing.
Yeah, and some of them actually got signed in the process of you trying to make them right.
Exactly. And the thing is, I didn't think about that. That wasn't at all the goal. But by doing this exercise, it turned out that some of the tracks were really good. And as I played them for people, I got interest. And so some of them signed, actually. Because if your goal is, you know, to make music for half an hour, that's a really easy to attain goal. You know, like, and if that's hard for you, then just say 15 minutes or even 10 minutes, or even just, you know, boot your computer and load up your software, but just always have something achievable. And then once you complete that goal, then you can start pushing yourself further, but always keeping things within reach. And then everything else will kind of just fall into place, which is exactly what happened. You know, a lot of great things have come from this project, and none of them were really my intention in doing it. They just kind of side products of that process.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's I think it was Tiga who said that success can be as restricting as failure in the sense that
Yeah.
you're trying to follow up on something instead of just doing your own thing in your
Yeah,
own way.
he's a perfect example because when Sunglasses at Night came out, everybody wanted that track, you know. And we were working together on stuff. We did quite a bit of remixes and stuff together, and that was always the pressure from the labels. You know, we would do. He didn't want to do another record like that, you know, and he almost regretted having put his name on it because now that was what is expected of him, and there was a lot less freedom to do other things. So we had stuff, we'd do something really cool and weird, and the label would like, this is not what I wanted, you know? And it's like, well, this is good, but it didn't matter to them. They just wanted to repeat the success of his other record. It was very limiting for him. And there's a book called Steal Like an Artist.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's one of the things they talk about is that it's actually liberating. Being an unknown is very liberating because nobody has any expectations. Nobody is putting you into a box. So you just do whatever you want. And you kind of need to, in a way, take advantage of that. Be happy that nobody's discovered you yet and put you in a box because when they do, then you need to be ready and accept that.
In terms of your working process, at what point do you start thinking about the mix? Do you mix your own tracks? Do you have any go-to hardware and software you use for mixing?
I do it as I go along, basically. I try to make things sound as good as possible because it's to have things in a ready state at any time, you know? Like, I do go back and do a proper mix when something is ready to be released, for example, because when you're working really quickly, you're not necessarily putting the attention that you need to do the best job of mixing.
And maybe you shouldn't be either. You shouldn't be thinking about
no,
that.
exactly. But I mean, it helps if it sounds good, you know?
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So it's
That's
good
the thing. You always want it to sound like a record almost straight away. Like,
Yeah.
we'll be like, because that gets you more excited in the studio because you're like, yeah, this sounds cool. This sounds like a track.
Yeah.
But pumping it too hard, limiting it too hard before you even begin to write it. So
Yeah, well, I was definitely guilty of that. A lot of my early records, when I discovered compression, were super compressed. And these days, I don't even use barely any compression. And I've also learned that if you mix things properly, using EQ and having things in the sort of right sonic spectrum, you know, having not too many frequencies overlapping, you can make something really loud without needing tons of compression on it. So in a way, like, compression makes you lazy, you know?
Yeah.
Like, not relying on that to make your stuff sound good makes you work harder. And then when you do put some compression on it, then it's going to sound even better.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about your live show, actually, because you use the TR8 live, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What else is involved?
Well, my approach is sort of a halfway between DJing and live because I found that my first live shows, I was spending too much time focusing on tiny little details, you know, like 3 tracks of hi-hats that I was mixing. And it was just, you kind of get lost and then you lose the big picture. And that's what I like about DJing is that it's very much focused on the big picture. You tell a 4-hour story with these records. But I also got bored just playing records as is. So using Tractor allows me to layer different bits. You know, I can make a beat or something that I'll bring just to layer on top of other stuff. So it's not necessarily just other people's music I play. Even when I do my own 100% original material, I'll use Tractor for that. Like, one of the things that bug me about live performance is that you basically have everything laid out on this grid in a certain order, and you can't really spontaneously say, oh, I want to play this thing I made, you know, 5 years ago or whatever, unless you have everything on your project. And I just hated that way of working. Whereas with Tractor, well, you have all the metadata and you have, you know, search tools, so you can say, oh yeah, I want to play this, and then just drop it in. And now with the remix decks, I started exporting my stuff as loops, and then I would play that. And now this stem format that they've announced is going to even take that even further. So it allowed me to play bits of my own stuff and bits of other people's stuff and mix it all together. But I like having the drum machine and sometimes other synths on top, so that I can layer stuff and just kind of improvise on the fly. So at any point, I could be playing, you know, just complete tracks that other people have done from beginning to end, or I could be composing completely on the fly and kind of all points in between, depending on my mood and my inspirations.
And where would you like to see it going in terms of, because right now it seems to be a kind of a golden era for what's possible in the DJ booth as an electronic producer performing live, because laptops have caught up with what we want to do.
Yeah.
There's so many little mini analog devices you can get for that are really affordable, and obviously the new stems format from Traktor. I mean, do you think this is like a hump right now where it's like, okay, this is going to go somewhere special?
I think so, and that's why it surprises me that there's a sort of a backlash against the stems thing. A lot of people, like producers, were saying, well, why don't you just play live? And it's like, well, this is an approach that is interesting, even just with your own material. But I think being able to use the vocal from another track, I think I think that's amazing. And on the DJ side, there's also purists who are like, I play records like the way they were meant, the way the artist intended them to be played. That's cool. But I think that, with so many people who are DJing now, the more you can inject your own personality, the better it is. And so being able to remix things on the fly, I think is amazing.
Nice one. So before we go to any questions, have you got one golden piece of advice for anyone who's working on music right now in their bedroom and is just playing around in Ableton, trying to release records?
I think, as I was saying before, like just finish things, finish it and focus on having fun and finishing things as quickly as possible. I had a friend who spent months working on a single track. It was like caught in a trap, because he was discouraged and it wasn't as good as he wanted it to be. And in that time, he could have written 10 tracks and maybe 9 of them would have been crap, but that one of them would have been amazing, much better than the one that he spent 3 months working on, So, and the thing too is that as you just finish more and more and more, it becomes easier. So you're basically practicing that.
Practicing finishing stuff.
Practicing finishing, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, cool. So have we got any questions in the crowd?
This question's a little bit genre specific, but like for music that has lyrics in it, oftentimes I think of sort of a melody and sort of a flow and way of singing something, but I can't think of actual words to put in it. Do you ever experience that? And what would you do? Should you, is it like a question of finding people who are really good lyricists, and what do you usually do in that case?
Yeah, I mean, I've never written lyrics and I've never sung, and it always struck me as something that was very intimidating, but I think it's the kind of thing that, like any other creative endeavor, it's a question of practice, Definitely being able to find collaborators is a good approach as well, but yeah, just write as much as possible.
Two part of this question. First, would you consider your most the influence, your most important influence in electronic music that influenced your work today? And if this influence is a group or a band of people, like, can you explain how they influence you over the years?
That's a good question. I have to say, and I think he's somewhere in the audience right now, but Richie's definitely one of my biggest influences, especially when he was one of the first DJs from out of town who played in Montreal. And I've been sending him music for a long time and getting feedback from him on it. Even, in hindsight, the tracks were not necessarily really good, but just that encouragement that he gave me was also very important. Being able to achieve a level of success, of commercial success, while still playing really underground music is something very commendable. Definitely influenced me in that regard. And otherwise, a lot of artists. James Holden, definitely. People who were not afraid to do something really different, because I think that's my biggest frustration with electronic music is how so many people don't take chances. They'll just, you go to the top 100 on Beatport and 50 tracks sound almost identical. And I understand because that it helps sell when you sound like an artist that is successful. But for me, it should be a form of art, and originality is really important. Even if the result can be not so interesting, I respect the fact that somebody will do something different, you know. So to go back to the question, that's why I like James Holden a lot, you know, because he's somebody who's definitely not afraid to take chances and kind of break away from even stuff that he used to do that people love, and just, you know, I mean, I'm sure a lot of his fans would love him to do records like he did back in the day, but he moves forward.
Hi, you spoke about the backlash that the STEMS system that Native Instruments is presenting. You see a lot of, people that are closed-minded on one end or the other. You were talking about producers saying, "Why don't you just play the music live?" And purist DJs being like, just play the whole records. From what I've noticed, I feel like for a field that's supposed to be very open-minded, there's a lot of people that are very closed-minded. And in your experience, how do you see that impacts our field that we work in?
It always struck me how conservative DJs and producers can be, especially for techno, which is supposed to be futuristic music, and yet they insist that you need to use tools that were, you know, made in the 70s and the 80s as the only real way of doing things. It always struck me as a strange paradox, you know, and I don't really understand where that comes from, but I personally think it's really important to just, you know, keep moving forward and to see what new technologies, you know, can offer us, and not think about, you know, like the whole vinyl versus computer debate. I think is ridiculous, because yeah, there's a certain area of overlap where the two of them are ways of playing, you know, songs, but what you can do with the computer is so much more than what you can do with turntables. And why would you want to limit yourself to that? And why especially would you look down on other people who make the artistic decision to try to innovate, and say, well, you know, you're not whatever because you use a computer, you're not a real DJ or whatever. You know, if the fact that I use Tractor now doesn't make me a real DJ, then I don't really care about not being a real DJ. I like, this is what I want to do. That for me is more important than, you know, conforming to somebody else's idea of what I'm supposed to be doing.